Hello everybody and welcome to my talk React Component Anti-Patterns. My name is Radoslav Stankov. I'm currently based in Sofia, Bulgaria, where I'm broadcasting from. And currently I'm the head of engineering at Product Hunt. In my talk, I'm going to share a lot of code and a lot of samples. Because of that, I have my talks listed here so you can check the slides in your own time. So what's the plan for today? So my plan for today is to give you a short history lesson to give you the context why a lot of those anti-patterns exist. And my second part of the talk would be explaining what's a good React component for me, how do I define it. And the final part would be the React anti-patterns. I'm going to go through certain patterns I have noticed in the React history that I think should be avoided in most cases. This is the second name of the talk is Radu approves the definite guide. So about a history lesson. So I'm going to share you my history with React. So I started in 2014 with working mostly with jQuery. Then in around October, I have done a lot of work with Backbone. I have worked with React combination with Rails. At some point in React ecosystem, there was also Flux, which is a bit forgotten nowadays because everybody switched to Redux around 2015. People started using React as a full-fledged app around the React router. In 2016, I personally started organizing my Redux with something called Redux Dux. At my work, we switched to like a full front-end app. We then moved to GraphQL. A lot of work has been done around the code splitting. And in December in 2018, React introduced hooks, which changed the way React was doing stuff. I'm using Next.js since 2019. And this is my personal history with React. This is the stages I have personally gone through with my history to React. And I have been there for a lot of the changes that the React itself had. And here is some of the things that were changes in the React history itself. React started as class components, like everything was a class. There was life cycles. There was introduction of the CSS modules. Initially, React was not very opinionated about the CSS. Later on, the concept of styled components appeared. At some point, React started supporting the functional components, where a component is just a function without the life cycles. The concept of high-order components was then started to appear in the React ecosystem. With the introduction of Flux, then there was the Redux and the whole way of where do we put the state, how do we manage the state. One other pattern that came at React at this point was also something that was called the Renderless components. Those were like components that just injects. Another pattern that appeared later on was the children as function, which is a pattern that is still used to this day. With the introduction of GraphQL, a lot of the React data fetching logic was moved around, and everything started be focusing more around the GraphQL ecosystem. And of course, we had hooks, which introduced a whole new way of working with our React components, allowing our functional components to do a bit more complicated things and making the class components obsolete and reinvalidating a lot of the good practices. And if you notice, this history has a lot of things happening to React. So a React component, which I would have designed in, let's say, 2014 when I started working with React, won't be considered best practice right now, because back then it would have been just like a class component. There might be like some high order functions and things like that. And because of that, there is a lot of battle scars in the React community, and there is a lot of confusion, and there is a lot of patterns. So the next thing I'm going to share is, okay, what's actually a good React component in 2021? So for me, when I'm defining a component, I'm trying to answer those questions. The first question is, what are the props this component needs? Then, what does this component do? What's its purpose? What are the component states? Like, what's the internal state of this component? What's the component logic? Is there anything logical there? And the last two questions I'm asking are a bit more around the maintainability. How I can trace the logic in this component. If I open this component, how easily I can understand what's required for this component, what's needed, and what's the logic there. And the final one is like, is this thing easy to change? Can I refactor it? Can I split the logic? Can I combine the components? And this all boils down to, is this component easy to understand? Is this component something that we are understanding very easily? So the way I usually put my components is I don't split them into high order components, functional class. I just put my components in a folder called components, and usually those are my reusable components, where I use the pattern of component as a folder, where I have the component name and the index file is the entry port of this component. Everything in this entry file is the public part of this component. And the way I'm structuring my components always follows these 5 steps. I first list the imports, which is required. Then I'm listing the types, the prop types of this component, because pretty much everybody switched to TypeScript nowadays. Before, we used to have those prop types library which was doing runtime checks. Now we are doing those things in compile checks. So the types, like what's the requirement of the component, is the second thing. Then I'm putting constants there, like things that are important for the content logic. And the next thing is I'm having the default export of the main component. And then at the bottom of the file, I just put like, is there any subcomponents, hooks, functions? So this is how a component file looks like for me. I'm importing, I'm having the interface and I always name these iprops, because when I open the file, I just scan for iprops. That's the second thing after the import, and this is what I need in order to use this component and to understand it. Second, and this is optional, I have like constants, like some values that are important for this component. And the third one, then I start the component itself. The component itself always have the export default function component name. So with this type, I know this is the component I care about. This is the entry point. And again, the component, the way I'm structuring it is I start with the hooks because that's required. Then I list the guard clauses, and in the bottom I always put the happy end. And in the end, again, I have a lot of like helper functions, subcomponents and things. They're just things in the bottom. Those are just things that are in the file, needed only when you need to change it, when you need to very deeply understand that file. I also, as I mentioned, use component as a folder structure. The way I use that is I use my components as containers. I split them into, like, I keep their GraphQL things inside. I keep the styles, I keep icons, I keep the utils, I put the test here. A lot of times my component have like private subcomponents, but the only thing I consider public here is the component itself. So the next part of my talk, when we went through the history and what I see as a good component. So from here, let me go through some of the anti-patterns I have noticed around the years. And what's an anti-pattern? An anti-pattern are certain patterns in software development that are considered bad programming practices. And those are opposed to like a good design pattern for things like that. The way I'm thinking about it is an anti-pattern is a code where when I looked at it, I look like that, or I look like that, or I look like that. Like I don't feel confident in this pattern. So why those anti-patterns exist? Like why do we have those anti-patterns? Why do they come? So the first reason is the React in the ecosystem evolved. We have the switch from JavaScript to float type to TypeScript. Often in our projects we have inconsistent designs, so we have to do some patterns to mitigate those. There is a lot of workarounds we have to do for our systems. We learn, like a lot of the patterns were good because they solve a concrete problem, then we found a better solutions. And one of the main reasons anti-patterns exist in general in software is that often the anti-patterns are just quick fixes and part of the least resistance. Like we need to do a change and we make it quick and dirty. So the way I'm going to structure the pattern is I'm going to give them a name. I'm going to give you example. I'm going to explain what's the problem, and I'm going to give you alternatives. So the first anti-pattern is override of CSS of inner component. So let's say we have this component which is rendering an H1, and it accepts a class name as a prop, so we can style the div, and we pass the style, and in this style what we have here is we say, okay, in my style just get to the H1 and color it red. And I have a small typo here. This is not a good pattern. So the thing here is that we are reaching really deep down into the component itself, and we know that this component has an H1. And what happens if we change this to H2? The class name comes from the parent, and the parent don't know that we are overwriting the class. So this is a bad thing. We shouldn't do that. And something which is the next step, how do we fix that? And often people just fix that by just adding another class name. So what people would do we are going to have the class name of the component, and then we are going to have a component that's called the header class name. And we are going to set the class name here. And we're going to accept, and we're still going to have this component here. And this is bad. And I mean, this works, it's better, it's easy. But the problem here is we are still coupling the structure of a component with its parent. We are adding this, we have to have a header class in this component. What happens if the header becomes like two components? Also, every time you pass the class name, you can change everything. Like this is a very big door for changes. So a better solution here is to ask yourself why we need to pass this class name. And often people say, I just want to have a red header. So a better solution here is to just have a property which is called color, and you set red. And then in your component, you can just use that. This is one fix. The other fix here is if we need so much to style the header itself, you can always pass it as a children to the component. Just don't style the component inside of it, because this breaks encapsulation. Another anti-pattern is the abuse of renderless components. So what are renderless components first? So this was a very popular pattern like 4 or 5 years ago, where what we were doing was we make components that don't render anything, but for example, they attach to DOM events, like for example, this window resize. So when we come here is we say window on resize, call this function, or window on scroll, call this function. And this was very useful because it was very easy just to sprinkle this across our components, and it was easy to manage. And this is an example of a pattern that was useful, but gets outdated because nowadays what we should do is just use hooks. Hooks provide a lot better encapsulations for a lot of renderless components. Like now we just have a hook that just attaches us to events. The other thing which we had a lot in the early days is class components with render methods. This is not very popular right now, but a long time ago, and I'm still seeing this in some code bases, people have components like that, where they have a class component, which have a render function, which have a function which is called render items, and in the render items, there is another render item function. And this was a very popular pattern back in the day because people wanted to split the renders. And I think this was the fix here is we should just have components. Like every time you think, okay, maybe I should have a function that renders stuff, that's actually component in disguise. Like in this case, we are just mapping on and we just have those components. It's a simple anti-pattern, it's not very serious, but it's worth mentioning. Another pattern, and this is a bit more controversial one, I have discussions with people about this one over time, is constant map instead of components. So this is something which I noticed a lot in my code base. So I noticed that we have a list of things, usually like links. So you have a list of things which is like two title of a link, two title of a link, two title of a link, and somewhere in your code you loop through this array and you map this to this component. And this looks very nice and tidy. This makes us as developers feel good. But the problem here is that often we start adding more properties, a lot more checks, and sometimes what if something is a menu link and something is a menu button. A lot better, and this is why React is great, is because it's declarative, so we can just say, okay, this is a menu link to title to about. It's very simple, just inline that. If you don't need this array for any special purposes, just use React. It's declarative enough. We don't need to create another declarative on top of that. Another anti-pattern I have noticed people using is decomposing record to props. This was also very popular, where we have a component and then we decompose some entity object into it. And decomposing is a bit dangerous because if we change the entity object, we actually don't know what's used in this component. The slightly better version is having manually passing post ID, post title, and post vote counts, because those are the things we need. And this is slightly better, but still, every time we need something, we have to do this. I think the better option is just pass entity object as they are. Especially when you use something like GraphQL and TypeScript, you can do stuff like get your backend to generate types through Apollo code gen, and just have like a fragment for each component and have a type, so you can actually have these proper typings. And having those GraphQL types would allow you to have a very neat system, so you don't need to decompose. Talking about typing, I'm just going to go to a quick anti-pattern I noticed. A lot of people just use, like I call it, the wildcard typing. They use a lot of any's, or they say, okay, this component accepts key prelude value, which is kind of the anything. A lot better for you is to just specify types, especially on the click hooks, being very explicit on the colors. If your component accepts DOM attributes, you can use the React HTML attributes and just say your error. But you want to be explicit. Another anti-pattern which is very used is the component as property. Component as property is where, and this is something we used a lot, we just allow our component to accept any component and then pass the props and split the props from one component to the other. And this leads to things like this, like having this very big list of like accepted components. And what we decided to do is we forbid accepting components. We are now just accepting component as HTMLs. This is also a quick one. A lot of the time people add unexpected defaults that make people confusing, so people should be aware of that. We are going now through some more performance ones. So using two components instead of one. Like I noticed this a lot. Like people have this pattern a lot. Is it active? Render this. If it's not active, use that. You can just do it with one check. It's simpler. Or if you, for example, have a component which is rendering stuff on different devices, there is device phone, device tablet or desktop. Maybe you can just say device phone. If it's a phone, you just do it this. A lot of times also people use unneeded closures. A needed closure is like case like that. You get a click handler and you create an anomalous function that just calls it. You can just do it like this. This is one of my pet peeves. Also, a lot of times we do a lot of unneeded loops in our applications. Like especially with GraphQL, we do a lot of unneeded loops. So yeah, this is pretty much my talk. I go through a lot of anti-patterns. There is a lot of other things I mentioned. I will be available after my talk in the Q&A room. So yeah, thank you very much. And as I mentioned, my talk slides are over here. Bye bye and see you in the Q&A room.